No Place Like Home by Hesba Stretton, produced by scrollreader.com. Chapter 1. An Old Hovel. There was no other home like it in all the parish of Broadmoor. It was a half-ruined hut, with walls bulging outward and a tattered roof of old thatch, overgrown with moss and yellow stonecrop. In one corner, a rusty iron pipe served as a chimney for the flat hearth, the only fireplace inside. A small lattice window with greenish glass and a bullseye in each pane let in just a sliver of summer sunshine and barely a glimmer of winter's gloomy light. From a few yards away, the hut looked no different from the ruins of an old lime kiln, next to which it had been built to shelter lime burners on their breaks. There was only one room downstairs, with an earthen floor hardened by years of heavy footsteps. Above, under the thatch, was a small loft reached by a steep ladder and a square hole in the ceiling. The roof sloped down on each side to meet the rough flooring, and nowhere was it high enough for even a short person to stand upright. Furniture was as rough and basic as the house itself. The fine household items Ruth Medway once prized in her pretty village cottage were missing in this poor hovel. Instead, there were a few broken chairs, a tabletop propped on a trunk of unbarked fir from the woods behind the lime kiln, some cracked crockery, 2 or 3 old boxes, and the essential saucepan and kettle she used for all her cooking. Upstairs, there was a low bed frame with a straw mattress, and beside it a chaff-stuffed mattress so close to the roof that the thatch almost brushed the sleeper's face. The loft had no window. Its only light came through the square hole in the floor.
"Home is home, be it never so homely,"
Ruth would often say, for she had learned to love the quiet place where her youngest and dearest child had been born. Behind the house lay the lime kiln woods, once bustling with quarries and kilns, but now long abandoned to the growth of trees and brushwood. The woods were a haven for all kinds of wild creatures, riddled with rabbit burrows and filled with singing birds and game the squire loved to preserve, except during shooting season, when the sharp crack of guns echoed all day. Little sound disturbed the hum of bees, the faint whir of hidden grasshoppers, and the myriad soft, delicate noises filling the stillness of the untouched woods. Day and night, summer and winter, each brought its own familiar sights and sounds to Ishmael, the youngest son of old Humphrey Medway. Ishmael was the youngest and the most unwelcome child to his father. Humphrey had barely welcomed his firstborn, and each child that followed was received with growing resentment.
Ah, another mouth to feed.
Ishmael was born last, when his mother's hair had already turned grey, and her back was bent from years of hard outdoor labour. The eldest son had grown up and married. His love for his mother faded into indifference. The other children, those who survived, were scattered, rarely caring to return home. Humphrey never spoke of any of them, yet sometimes in the evening, when Ruth paused to rest and watched the kettle boil over the crackling fire, she would count their names on her fingers. 8 names she sighed over, but when she came to the 9th, her brown, wrinkled face softened into a fleeting smile as she murmured,
"Ishmael."
Ruth was not one to brood over the past. Her life was too hard to dwell on old memories. She'd grown fond of the lonely hut where Ishmael was born, the only home he had ever known. He was free to keep pet dormice and hedgehogs from the woods, though the gamekeeper forbade him from having a rabbit, and Ruth wasn't allowed to keep a cat. A dog was entirely out of the question. Yet a tame starling and a white owl, which roosted under the thatched roof and flew silently through the dusk at his call, filled the place with life and interest for him. The woods behind the hut had been Ishmael's playground since early childhood, and not even the grandest house in Broadmoor could tempt him to leave his home. After she married, Ruth taught herself to read during the long evenings she spent alone, while Humphrey stayed late at the village inn. In her loneliness, she turned to the Bible, her only book besides a prayer book and an old hymnal. Through her reading, she came to believe with simple, unwavering faith that God so loved the world
that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Christ will not perish, but have everlasting life. Oh, Jesus Christ has truly given himself as a ransom for me. What amazing love.
These beliefs became deeply rooted in her heart, and she read the Bible eagerly for comfort. From its well-worn pages, she chose the name of her youngest and dearest child.
Ishmael, because the Lord has heard my affliction.
Ruth was never a woman of many words, especially about matters close to her heart. Humphrey often boasted of her submission, claiming she wouldn't dare cheep a word against him. In her youth, she had sung in the village choir, and now Ishmael had taken her old place in the singing gallery. One of her greatest pleasures was slipping quietly just inside the church door, where her poor clothing would go unnoticed, to listen to the voices from the gallery above. She joined in singing.
Glory be to the Father.
At the close of each familiar psalm, in that space, her bent back seemed to ache less, and her weary limbs found rest. Throughout the week, while picking stones or hoeing thistles in the fields, her withered lips would often murmur the words,
Glory be to the Father.
In those moments, she felt like a traveller in a hot, barren land, coming upon a small spring of fresh water. The journey wasn't over, but the living water gave her strength to continue. Humphrey Medway and his eldest son had such a bad reputation in the parish, known for being idle and drunken vagabonds, that it cast a shadow over Ruth and Ishmael as well. This reputation effectively isolated them, cutting them off from decent and friendly neighbours. Ishmael didn't feel the weight of it until he started attending the village school, where the other children were warned to stay away from Humphrey Medway's boy. The women who worked with Ruth in the fields also kept their distance, not because they were better off, but because Ruth was so silent and reserved. Thus, Ruth and Ishmael had no companionship except each other, but that was enough for them. For Ruth, it was enough to think of her boy throughout the day and to hear his steady, healthy breathing beside her at night. For Ishmael, the woods surrounding their home provided endless occupation and joy. Although they lacked friends, they were not without an enemy. The hut's proximity to the woods alone was enough to rouse the suspicions of the squire's gamekeeper Nutkin, even if he hadn't already held a grudge against the Medway family.
Oh, I despise that family.
Long before Ishmael was born, a bitter hatred had developed between Nutkin and young Humphrey, Ishmael's eldest brother. Humphrey had stolen away the girl Nutkin had hoped to marry. Though Nutkin had married soon after, he never forgave the offence and harboured a deep enmity toward Humphrey and anyone connected to him. Even the name Medway was hateful to him. Recently, Ishmael had added fuel to the fire by winning a few prizes at the village school,
Good job, Ishmael.
besting Nutkin's own son, who was about the same age and resented being beaten by the despised son of old Humphrey.
How did you not beat him? Why did he win?
Despite Nutkin's efforts, he'd been unable to evict old Humphrey from the wretched hut. Ruth paid the rent of $1 a week punctually, even if it meant going without food. She knew that failure to do so would send her and her drunken husband to the parish workhouse. The farmer who leased the lime kiln and the hut gave Ruth work on his farm and showed her some favour, ensuring that they could stay. Nutkin, frustrated, could only watch and wait, eager to catch them in any trespass that could be punished by law. For 13 years, Ruth had worked at Willow's farm. Many hot summer days saw baby Ishmael lying swaddled in an old shawl under the hedgerows, while his mother laboured in the harvest fields. As soon as he was able, Ishmael began to earn a few pence himself by scaring crows from the growing corn or helping tend sheep during the chilly spring lambing season. For the past 2 years, Ishmael's father had grumbled about him being an idle mouth to feed.
Why you don't work? You're just sitting around and lazy and idle.
Though Ruth rarely saw a penny of Humphrey's money, it had been a struggle for her to keep Ishmael in school. But now the time had come for him to stop being a child and start earning his living through regular work. Mr. Chipchase, the farmer, had agreed to take Ishmael on as a waggoner's boy, promising that if he proved to be a good and steady lad, he would make a man of him.
Mother.
Ishmael said as they sat together on the doorstep in the long, light June evening, listening to the cuckoo and the thrushes singing in the woods.
I told the teacher I'm starting work on Monday. She offered to let me take little Elsie into the woods tomorrow and said she would prepare dinner for us to enjoy there. She mentioned that I've always been a good boy at school and expressed her regret at losing me.
I'm glad she's sorry to lose you. If you weren't home every night, I don't know what I would do without you, Ishmael. I almost wish you were a tiny little boy again.
When I'm a man, you won't have to go out working in the fields anymore, or wear yourself out, Mother. We'll never leave this place, because there's no place like home. But I'll get the master to let me build a better house that'll keep you warm and dry, and we'll live here together until we die. Won't we, Mother?
Yes, Lord, please bring that about.
She answered softly, with a smile on her weathered face, knowing how much sooner she would die than her young son, who was still little more than a child.
I should think it would please God,
Ishmael replied in a quiet voice.
He doesn't want us to always be very poor, poorer than other folks. Does he, Mother?
No, I don't know. His own son was born in a stable and died on the cross while people mocked him. I can't say what you and I will have to endure, Ishmael. All we can do is say, please, God.
It was late before Ishmael climbed the ladder to the cramped loft overhead and settled into his bed beneath the low thatch. But it was after midnight when Ruth, with her wrinkled yet strong arms, helped her drunken husband climb, step by step, up the ladder. Every night she feared her strength might fail her, that he could fall, either crippled or lifeless, to the floor below.
Thank God.
She always cried in the depths of her soul when his sluggish, heavy feet were safely planted on the floor above. Chapter 2. In the Woods. The village schoolmistress, Mrs. Cliff, knew Ruth well, having employed her as a laundress ever since taking charge of the school. No linen was sweeter or whiter than what Ruth washed and dried on the gorse bushes around the old lime kiln. Ishmael had been one of Mrs. Cliff's most consistent and least troublesome students, and she appreciated his good behaviour enough to trust her little girl Elsie to his care for a long day in the limekiln woods. Spring had crept in slowly through May, and though it was now June, the trees were still not fully leafed. The delicate lattice of branches above left plenty of open spaces for the sunlight to stream through, casting a greenish glow on the half-transparent leaves. There was no thick tangle of burdock and thistle yet to trip them as they strolled beneath the hazel bushes. Patches of bluebells blanketed the dusky earth in some spots, and in a few rare places, known only to Ishmael, white lilies of the valley grew amid their broad green leaves. Though no grand towering forest trees took root in the thin soil, every now and then a stunted elm or oak spread its crooked branches. Clumps of larches grew tall and thin, their pointed tops piercing the sky in close company. And what a sky it was! A deeper blue than the bluebells beneath the hazels, scattered with clouds whiter than the lilies. Some clouds gleamed brightly, while others floated lazily, tinged with a pearly grey, carried by the soft, fresh westerly wind. Ishmael felt a deep pride in all of it, as if the woods, the flowers, and the sky were his own.
Sit down and listen, Elsie,
he said, throwing himself down under an elm tree. He held his breath in delight, straining his ears to catch the many notes of the birds singing in the early morning sunlight.
Do you hear that?
He asked, pointing out the merry whistle of a starling. There was also the deep, soft cooing of wood pigeons, calling from their bulky nests high in the fir trees. The harsh cry of a jay cut through the air as it flitted across the open space between the trees, its bright blue wing feathers flashing in the sunlight. More frequent than any other sound, except perhaps the constant chirping of sparrows, was the deep, steady call of the rooks, sailing high in the air. But perhaps the clearest and most cheerful notes of all were the songs of the thrushes and blackbirds in the bushes surrounding them. Ishmael also recognized the calls of the kingfisher and the woodpecker, the plaintive cry of the lapwing, and the call of the little moor lion from the swampy ground, overgrown with waterweeds and tall bulrushes. Every sound, whether loud or soft, from the busy woodlands, was familiar to him. But these sounds had never seemed so sweet as they did now, with Elsie beside him, gazing up at him in admiration as he shared his knowledge. Though Elsie was far ahead of him at school, here she sat wide-eyed, hanging on every word.
"Oh, Ishmael,"
she exclaimed, sighing with happiness and admiration.
"I should think nobody in the world knows as much as you."
Never before had Ishmael heard such words spoken to him, and they left him feeling almost dizzy with pride. He began to think of what other wonders he could show or tell her. Yes, there were more secrets he could reveal to her awestruck gaze. The woods were beautiful, but Ishmael knew what was hidden beneath the ground, as well as what lay in plain sight. Below their feet, the earth was honeycombed with long-abandoned galleries, roadways, and tunnels, where limestone had been quarried ages ago, then hauled to the surface through shafts that opened on the hillsides. These winding and twisting subterranean paths stretched far away from the light of day. Even above ground, there were signs of them, basin-like hollows of various depths and sizes, where the unstable earth had sunk in. Some of the hollows were filled with water, forming small pools that sparkled in the sunlight, while others were dry, basin-like depressions, green with turf and coltsfoot, where wild strawberries grew. Ishmael and Elsie had busily gathered the tiny red fruit, stringing them on long blades of grass to keep as a dessert for the meal they planned to eat in the woods. Ishmael had a surprise in store for Elsie. He waited for just the right moment, when she would be tired and hungry, and the sun's heat would press down on them. Then he would lead her to the cool shelter of a nearby cave, where he could reveal the hidden entrance to the old limestone quarry. They eventually reached a wide, open glade that stretched between two rows of trees. This was the famous spot for the autumn shooting parties, where the squire's guests would spend entire days hunting. In the long, untrodden grass, the discarded cartridge cases from last year's shoot still lay scattered about. Ishmael told Elsie how the sound of gunfire would crackle through the air all day long, filling the woods with the acrid smell of gunpowder and thick smoke that tainted the fresh air. When the day of shooting was over, the woods would fall into an eerie silence, as if the timid creatures that lived there had been scared into hiding.
And the rabbits stay in their burrows,
Ishmael said.
and don't come out to play after sunset, like they do on other nights. Hundreds and thousands of them, running after each other and tumbling about, just like us on the green when we've a holiday. You can see their little white tails bobbing in the dusk. If you sit very still, they'll come almost to your feet, and the bats come out, along with the cockchafers and the big white owls that make no sound when they fly. I'll show you our big owl at home before you leave tonight.
They were strolling leisurely along the glade, when suddenly a loud whirring and fluttering of wings erupted from under their very feet. A pheasant, startled from her nest, sprang up into the air with a rush. To Elsie, it seemed as if the bird had flown straight out from the ground, and she let out a small scream of fright. Ishmael, however, dropped to his knees immediately, parting the tangled grass that concealed the nest. There, nestled together, was a cluster of 10 brown eggs, still warm from the mother hen's brooding.
Oh!
Cried Elsie eagerly.
Can't we have some of them for dinner? Only we can't cook them without a fire and a saucepan.
Aye, but we can.
Ishmael replied, proud of his knowledge.
We can make a fire and roast them in the ashes. We won't take more than 4, 2 apiece, and I can tell which ones are the freshest. See, I've got a match in my pocket, and we'll pick up some sticks and light a fire in a place I know, where nobody can find us.
As they gathered sticks, Ishmael led Elsie to his secret cave. It was situated halfway down a steep slope, overgrown with hazel bushes and brambles. The low archway of the entrance was barely a yard high and completely hidden by the brushwood. Inside, the ceiling rose to a comfortable height, and the limestone floor was dry, making it a pleasant retreat. The cave was large enough to hold 20 to 30 people, and a soft green twilight filtered in through the dense interwoven undergrowth. The air inside was cool and refreshing, offering a perfect refuge from the heat of the midday sun that now shone high in the blue sky.
Look, Elsie,
Said Ishmael, guiding her to the back of the cave, where a small hole, like a large rabbit burrow, led into a shadowy space beyond.
I've crawled through there many a time, and if it wasn't for your frock, we'd go now, you and me. Oh, it goes for miles under the wood. Sometimes there's a bit of light from cracks in the ground, and there are black, still pools with just a tiny sparkle to show where they are. Stones glisten from the roof, with drops of water always falling from them. Oh, I wish you were a boy and could creep in along with me.
Oh, couldn't I?
Elsie asked eagerly.
No, it'd never do.
Ishmael said decisively.
Never mind. I'll light the fire now, and we'll have our dinner.
The fire was quickly started, and as it died down a little, they buried the 4 eggs in the hot embers to roast. Ishmael fetched a can of sparkling water from a spring trickling down the rocks, while Elsie laid out their meal. Now she sat on a large stone, hands resting idly in her lap, enjoying the moment. Her blue eyes gazed happily at the waving branches outside, their shadows dancing across the cave floor in a constant, playful motion.
Oh, Ishmael,
She called out.
I must recite the song Mother taught me about. That's the way for Billy and me. It feels like it was written just for us. I'll say it while the eggs are roasting.
Elsie began to recite with a smile, her voice filling the cool cave.
Where the pools are bright and deep, where the gray trout lies asleep, up the river and over the lea. That's the way for Billy and me. Where the blackbird sings the latest, where the hawthorn blooms the sweetest, where the nestlings chirp and flee. That's the way for Billy and me. Where the mowers mow the cleanest, where the hay lies thickest and greenest, there to trace the homeward bee. That's the way for Billy and me. Where the hazel bank is steepest, where the shadow falls the deepest, where the clustering nuts fall free. That's the way for Billy and me. Why the boys should drive away little maidens in their play, or love to banter and fight so well, that's a thing I never could tell. But this I know, I love to play. Through the meadow, among the hay, up the water, and over the lea. That's the way for Billy and me.
Ishmael listened in quiet contentment as Elsie's voice echoed softly in the cool cave, the warmth of the fire and the beauty of the day wrapping them both in a sense of peace and happiness. But Elsie had barely finished the last line when the branches outside the cave slowly parted and a man's head bent down, peering in. It was a rugged, sunburnt face, one she recognized all too well but had never liked. Now it filled her with a vague sense of terror. Ishmael, kneeling by the smouldering fire, was completely absorbed in checking the eggs, oblivious to the darkening of the green twilight as the gamekeeper, Nutkin, stooped under the archway. Ishmael chuckled softly, delighted as he pulled an egg from the hot embers.
That one's done, Elsie.
He called out cheerfully.
What's done?
Came Nutkin's harsh voice, startling Ishmael.
I saw the smoke from your fire, you young rascal, and came to see what mischief you're up to. What's this? Pheasant's eggs? Pheasant's eggs. Would nothing else serve you for your dinner?
Ishmael froze, still kneeling, his eyes wide with shock as he looked up at the gamekeeper's angry, triumphant face. His heart pounded in his chest. What could he say? The evidence was right there, the eggs in the ashes, and one in his outstretched hand. He felt paralyzed, unable to drop the egg or speak. He hadn't thought of the eggs as stolen when Elsie had voiced her innocent wish, but now he realized the trouble he was in.
I suppose you know,
Nutkin said slowly, his words cutting like a knife.
that I'm going to take you to jail for this?
Oh, no, no!
Elsie cried out in terror.
We didn't know it was wrong, did we, Ishmael? The eggs were just on the ground. We might have stepped on them. Please don't send us to jail.
It's not you,
Nutkin sneered.
just this young scoundrel here. You might have to face the justices, but he's the one going to jail for poaching and stealing. I've warned the squire about this lot 100 times, and now he'll believe me. Get up, you rascal, and come with me.
Ishmael suddenly let out a loud, bitter cry, the sound echoing off the walls of the cave and reverberating back from the old quarry.
Oh, what will Mother say when she hears of it?
He sobbed.
And what will father say?
Nutkin mocked cruelly.
And Brother Humphrey? We'll make sure you don't grow up like them, drunkards and a disgrace to the parish. Come along now. And you, Elsie,
He added, turning to the tearful girl.
you run home and tell your mother to be more careful about who you keep company with. The squire'll believe me now.
With that, Nutkin yanked Ishmael out of the cave and pulled a thick rope from his pocket. He quickly tied it into makeshift handcuffs, binding Ishmael's hands and fastening the boy to himself. Elsie, sobbing, followed them to the white, dusty road that led toward Uptown, where the police station stood. She watched them disappear from sight, her heart heavy with sorrow, before slowly making her way home, almost heartbroken, to tell her mother what had happened. Chapter 3, Saturday and Sunday. Ruth had spent the entire day working hard, hoeing thistles in the fields. Many times she lifted her eyes toward the green woods where Ishmael and Elsie were playing, remembering the rare holiday moments of her own youth. The thought of the children's joy lightened her burden, and though she was tired by the time the church clock struck the hour to leave the field, she hurried along the hedge, eager to get home sooner. She knew Ishmael and Elsie would be hungry by the time she had tea ready, and Mrs. Chipchase had promised her some buttermilk to make buttermilk pikelets as a special treat. A pleasant excitement stirred within Ruth, but it was mixed with a vague sense of unease. Ishmael was about to leave behind the innocence of childhood and enter the trials and duties of boyhood, a stage where she had lost all her other children. He was on the verge of slipping out from under her protective care, just as the half-fledged hedge sparrows fluttered from the thorn bushes, preparing to leave their nest. Her other sons and daughters had grown indifferent to their home, caring no more for it than this year's nestlings would care for the old nest come next spring. But Ishmael was different. Unlike the others, who had all taken after their father and saw their mother as little more than a servant, Ishmael was thoughtful and caring. Ruth often told herself that she hadn't been the best mother to her older children, back when her faith had been weaker, but now she saw how marvellously good God had been to her, giving her a son like Ishmael when she was weary, worn down, and grey-haired. Mrs. Chipchase nearly filled Ruth's large brown pitcher with buttermilk and added a few spoonfuls of tea wrapped in a twist of paper. Ruth was a favourite of hers, a quiet, harmless old woman, and Mrs. Chipchase lingered a moment at the door to exchange a few words.
"Make sure Ishmael's here on time in the mornings,"
she said.
"The master's very particular."
I'm sure.
Ruth replied falteringly.
I don't know how to thank you and the master for taking him. It'll be the making of him, I know. He's a good lad, ma'am. God bless him.
Ruth rarely spoke so many words at once, except to Ishmael, but her heart was full. The farmhouse was simple and homely, yet there was a sense of abundance about it, something Ruth was noticing for the first time, as if she too could share in it. Standing at the kitchen door, she could see the large table where Ishmael would soon eat, where a ploughboy now sat, engrossed in a huge basin of food, ladled from a big iron pot hanging near the fire. The rich smell of the broth filled the air, and Ruth couldn't help but feel a sense of promise that her boy would grow up strong and healthy, able to satisfy his hunger with good food.
He hath filled the hungry with good things,
she whispered to herself as she lifted her brown pitcher and, with a curtsy to Mrs. Chipchase, turned to leave. Suddenly, a loud, rough voice rang out from the far end of the farmyard.
"Ruth Medway, Nutkin has dragged Ishmael to jail for stealing pheasants' eggs in the wood."
"There's the master come home. Whatever is he shouting, Ruth?"
Ruth stood frozen, a faint smile still lingering on her wrinkled face, but it faded as the meaning of the words sank in. The sky seemed to darken, the sunshine vanished, and a wave of dizziness overwhelmed her, making the solid ground beneath her feet feel like it was spinning. The loud crash of her brown pitcher, slipping from her grasp and shattering into countless pieces on the stone causeway, jolted her back to reality.
"What's the matter?"
cried Mrs. Chipchase, rushing to the door just as her husband arrived.
"Matter enough,"
he replied.
"Here's our new waggoner's lad, meant to start Monday, hauled off to jail for poaching. Nutkin caught Ishmael and Elsie roasting pheasant eggs in the wood. Eggs stolen straight from the nest. There's no chance of him getting off, not with the squire so mad about his game. Nutkin's swearing he'll lock Ishmael up to keep him out of trouble. I'm sorry for you, Ruth, having a family like that. I thought Ishmael would be a comfort to you in your old age, but the boy knew better, and he's got no excuse."
"It was just a lad's trick,"
said Mrs. Chipchase, trying to defend him.
"Something any child might do. Ishmael never stole an egg of mine when I set him to gather them. He brought in as many as any of our own boys, and he's as honest as the day, I'm sure of it."
Thank you kindly, ma'am.
Ruth murmured, her voice barely audible as she turned and slowly walked away, head bowed, her steps unsteady. How suddenly her 60 years weighed upon her, pressing her down like a heavy burden. The road she had walked so many times, through all seasons, to earn bread for herself and Ishmael, now felt rougher, every step a painful effort. Her vision blurred and she wondered if she was half blind, for everything seemed dim and unclear. Where had all the merry sounds of the summer evening gone? Ruth felt a numbness and stupor clouding her mind as she fumbled with the old key, trying to fit it into the lock of the small, weathered hut, the only home Ishmael had ever known. He had never spent a single night away from it, and now he would not be coming home tonight. She sank down onto the doorstep, rocking back and forth in mute despair. No tears came to her eyes. She was old, and her tears were long exhausted. Instead, heavy sobs racked her body over and over again. There was no hope in her heart. She thought of Nutkin's hatred for her family, her husband's wretched reputation, and how these dark shadows hung over Ishmael now. The rector's family had left for foreign parts for 6 months, leaving a stranger, unfamiliar with Ishmael, to tend to the parish. Nutkin had the squire's ear. His influence was absolute. There was no hope for Ishmael. In prison, the home was poor, dark, and miserable enough, but it was a home. How empty it felt now. If only Ishmael were there, it would still be home, a true home for both of them. Ruth slumped down on the desolate hearth, her heart aching. She tried to pray, to think of God, but her mind could focus only on Ishmael. Her soul was in the deepest depths of grief. All night she lay awake. The little bed beside her, where Ishmael usually slept, was empty for the first time. She strained her ears, longing to hear his quiet breathing, but it never came. Her husband had staggered home so drunk that she hadn't dared help him up the ladder, and he now lay in a dead sleep on the floor below. Over and over, Ruth counted her 9 children on her fingers, some living, some dead, her voice breaking into sobs as she whispered the name.
Ishmael.
Ruth had mourned her dead children and grieved over the living ones who had forsaken her, but no sorrow compared to this. None of them had ever been in prison, and now it was her youngest and dearest, her best, who had fallen into deep disgrace. When morning came, the thought of going to church made her heart sink. Ishmael wouldn't be in the singing gallery, and how could she sing while he languished in prison? Humphrey, with a curse, forbade her to go to Uptown to see Ishmael, and he sat by the wood fire all morning to make sure she obeyed. He spent the hours cursing their son as a disgrace, but Ruth didn't utter a word. She'd been silent for so long that she hardly knew how to speak, except to Ishmael. When her husband finally left in the afternoon, she welcomed the solitude and silence. Sitting alone, with her wrinkled face buried in her hands, Ruth was deaf, blind, and mute to everything but her sorrow. Then, she suddenly felt the warmth of loving arms around her neck. For a moment, she thought it was Ishmael, but when she looked up, she saw it was Elsie. Her mother, Mrs. Clift, stood nearby. Ruth rose to drop a curtsy to the schoolmistress, but Mrs. Clift took her rough, cramped hand between both of her own and bent forward to kiss her cheek. Ruth's face flushed slightly, and a strange mixture of surprise and comfort flickered through the darkness of her grief.
"I want you to make me a cup of tea,"
said Mrs. Clift, grateful for something to do. Ruth busied herself kindling the fire and filling her small tin kettle from the well. For a few fleeting moments, she almost forgot her troubles. But when the tea was ready, she couldn't bring herself to eat, even though Elsie had brought dainty tea cakes to tempt her.
"I've been up to the hall and spoken with Mr. Lansdowne,"
Mrs. Clift said, as they sat together at the rough little table.
"Elsie has to go before the magistrates tomorrow in Uptown, and I went to speak on behalf of poor Ishmael. But there isn't much hope, Ruth. Mr. Lansdowne says Nutkin claims that Ishmael has been a nuisance in the woods since he was a baby and that the whole village believes him to be in league with poachers. But we both know that's not the truth.
Ruth shook her head in sorrowful denial.
I told the squire that,
said Mrs. Clift softly.
He replied that women never could understand poaching as a crime. I said I couldn't see how taking a few eggs from a wild bird's nest was such a terrible sin, not bad enough to send a young lad to jail for. But he insisted it wasn't just that. He said the whole Medway family had been a plague and a pest to the parish for years, and that it would be a kindness to check Ishmael before he went the same way. Ruth, I'm more grieved than I can express.
Once more, Ruth shook her grey head silently, unable to argue, yet refusing to accept the harsh judgment.
I've been thinking about how lonely you are, Ruth,
continued Mrs. Clift,
and how you have to bear the sins of your husband and sons. It seems to me that the only comfort in times like this is to remember our Lord's life here on earth. Do you recall the words, "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief? And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not."
Mrs. Clift's gentle voice paused, giving Ruth time to absorb the words. Ruth covered her troubled face with her hands. It struck her deeply. The Lord Jesus, too, had been despised and rejected, just as she was by her neighbours. He had been a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief far more deeply than she ever could be. Did her old companions in the village turn their faces away from her? Yes, but all the world had turned away from him who had come to save them. Even as he hung on the cross, those who passed by had mocked him, wagging their heads in scorn, while the chief priests, elders, and even the thieves crucified beside him jeered at him.
Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows,
Mrs. Clift resumed in her quiet, soothing tone.
He was wounded for our transgressions. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed.
Ruth began to feel a healing peace settle over her heart. She was not carrying her burdens alone, as she had believed through the long, dark night. The Lord himself had borne her griefs and carried her sorrows. He had been wounded for her transgressions and for Ishmael's too. A deep sense of his love, compassion, and shared suffering filled her aching soul.
All we like sheep have gone astray,
Mrs. Clift continued.
We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth.
Ruth sat quietly, the words sinking into her heart, and for the first time since the dreadful news, she felt a glimmer of hope. An opening not his mouth, was that not like herself? Ruth could not cry aloud, nor speak many words to make her grief known to the world. Yes, it was true. Jesus Christ had walked her path of sorrows, endured scorn, and remained in silence. Though her head was bowed, her heart felt lifted. The suffering Son of God made her own burden of suffering easier to bear. Dusk was beginning to fall as Mrs. Clift bade her good night, and Ruth decided to walk a little way with her along the road. When she returned to her lonely home, she hesitated for a moment, trembling and reluctant to step back into its dark solitude. Since Ishmael had been a baby in her arms, it had always been her custom to sing, "Glory to thee, my God," as the last thing before he went to bed, except on the rare occasions when Humphrey was home. Last night, the first night Ishmael had been away, she hadn't thought of it, but now the thought crept into her mind, and she couldn't shake it. Perhaps, this Sunday evening, Ishmael was singing the hymn alone in his cell at Uptown. Tears, which had not come the night before, welled up in her dim eyes. Sitting down in her old chair by the dark hearth, Ruth began to sing the hymn, her voice low and faltering. It was so soft it could hardly have been heard beyond the threshold, but she sang it through to the end, feeling the quiet solace of the familiar words. Chapter 4. The Magistrates Meeting. Uptown hardly deserved the title of town. It was little more than a large village. Yet it served as the centre of a wide agricultural district, hosting a small weekly market for butter and eggs. The farmers took their corn to a more significant market in the county town. At regular intervals, a magistrates meeting was held in Uptown, and there was a police station just outside the village with 2 small cells, though they were rarely occupied. Since noonday on Saturday, one of those cells had held Ishmael. Ruth, heavy-hearted but sustained by a quiet reserve of courage, made her way to Uptown on Monday morning. There was more bustle than usual in the narrow street, as was always the case when the magistrates arrived to hear the minor cases awaiting judgment. Outside the inn where the justice's room was located, groups of somewhat unsavoury characters lingered, waiting for the proceedings. In the inn yard, Nutkin stood eagerly talking to one of the magistrates who had arrived early and was just dismounting from his horse. Ruth saw him, but acted as if she hadn't, her entire being focused on one thing: watching for Ishmael to appear along the road from the police station. She barely noticed the growing crowd, or the stir around her as more magistrates rode in and the clerk arrived with his blue bag full of papers. Even when Mrs. Clift appeared with Elsie and Squire Lansdowne entered the inn, Ruth's attention was elsewhere, her thoughts consumed by the dread and hope swirling inside her. Finally, Ishmael came into view, walking beside a policeman who held him firmly by the collar, as if to remind him there was no chance of escape. But could this be Ishmael? The lad before her was sullen and scowling, his hair rough and uncombed, his face streaked with the remnants of tears. He was so close, yet he never lifted his eyes to meet hers. He would have passed by without a glance if Ruth had not cried out in a heart-wrenching voice.
"Oh, Ishmael, my son."
It's my mother.
Ishmael said softly as the policeman tightened his grip on the boy's collar.
Don't come inside, mother dear. It wouldn't do any good, and it would just make me cry. Go home, now that you've seen me, to say goodbye. Will you let me loose to kiss my mother?
He asked, looking up at the policeman.
Aye, if you're quick about it.
The officer replied. For a brief moment, the young boy, barely more than a child, and his bent, grey-haired mother stood clinging to each other, arms wrapped tightly in a desperate embrace. Ruth felt as if she couldn't let him go. It seemed only days ago that he had been a baby cradled in her arms, and now he stood before her as a prisoner, charged with breaking the laws of the land. But Ishmael gently loosened his hands and allowed himself to be led into the magistrate's room. Ruth sank down onto the lowest step of a horse block beneath the open window, where the muffled hum of voices drifted to her ears. She had no sense of how much time passed, only that eventually a young woman, gaily dressed and bold in appearance, came up to her and spoke in a tone of pity.
"Don't take on so, Mrs. Medway,"
the woman said kindly.
"You're a good woman, I know, but luck's against you. Nutkin was hard on him, and they've given him 3 months in the county jail."
"My son?"
Ruth asked, looking up with a dazed, vacant expression in her eyes.
"Aye,"
the woman confirmed.
"Ishmael Medway, 13 years old, 3 months for stealing pheasant's eggs."
Ruth heard no more. The words struck her with such force that her mind went blank. She tried to stand, but instead collapsed forward, falling heavily onto the pavement in a deep swoon. A crowd quickly gathered around her as she lay unconscious. Meanwhile, Ishmael was being marched out of the inn by the policeman. He glanced around anxiously, searching for a final glimpse of his mother's face.
It's best she's gone,
he told himself, choking back a sob.
But I wish I could have seen her one more time.
As Ishmael was led away, his young heart was consumed with confusion and sorrow. He felt as if he were going to die in the prison they were sending him to, and feared he would never see his mother again. His mind reeled with grief. He was portrayed as a hopeless thief and poacher, with every circumstance stacked against him. His father's infamous reputation, his older brother's tarnished names, and even his own confession that he had spent so much time roaming the woods that he knew every inch of them. Even his tearful confession that he knew he had no right to the eggs worked against him. It was as if the entire world had conspired to bring him down. How he was being taken to jail, a disgrace to his poor mother. And today, of all days, this was supposed to be the day he would start earning a living and finally ease her burden. Instead, he had become a greater trouble to her than any of the others, worse even than his father, who came home drunk or angry every night. What could he ever do to make up for this? His young heart concluded in despair that he could do nothing better than to die. It was late when Ruth finally reached home that evening. Her husband, Humphrey, was waiting for her, sober but sullen, his usual hard, tyrannical self, treating her as though she were no more than a silent, spiritless drudge.
So,
He growled as she stepped feebly over the threshold.
this is what it's come to. Thy fine lad's got hisself into jail. This comes of book-learning and psalm-singing, eh? He brings shame on all on us. Ne'er a one on us was ever up afore the justices till now. And they say it the labour in vain as he's got 3 months. And serve him right, I say. I side with Nutkin, the squire, and the justices, all gentlemen. If I had a bit of land, I'd hang every poacher that set foot on it. And a young lad like him, what'll he be when he's a man? I'd send him to Botany Bay, I would. I'm on the side of justice, and if ever Ishmael crosses this doorsill again, I'll thresh him within an inch of his life. I'll break every bone in his body, and thine too.
He shouted, his fury growing.
If thee don't open that cursed mouth of thine and say something!
I'm ill, Humphrey.
Ruth replied meekly.
I fainted dead when they told me.
Fainted?
He sneered.
Don't be ridiculous. Only fine ladies do that, not a working woman like you. Faint or not, listen to me. Ishmael will never set foot over this doorstep again. I won't shelter any poachers or jailbirds under my roof.
Ruth quietly continued lighting the fire and boiling the kettle. In spite of her husband's threats and jeers, it was a relief to be home, away from the stir of the little town and the prying eyes of strangers. Even the harshness of Humphrey's words couldn't fully diminish the comfort of being at her own fireside. When he left, the silence of the dark hut was a welcome solace. Alone, Ruth could finally gather her thoughts. Just as our eyes begin to see faintly in the darkest night, so her soul, in its deepest trouble, began to reach toward God and find a glimmer of light. As she sat in the quiet, her mind returned to the old Bible story from which she had taken Ishmael's name. She thought of Hagar in the wilderness, a runaway slave fleeing from her mistress, and how God had heard her affliction. She remembered how Hagar, homeless and wandering, had been driven into the wilderness again, where her son Ishmael nearly died of thirst. Hagar had cast him under a shrub to die, unable to bear watching him perish, but God heard the voice of the lad and sent his angel to rescue them.
Thou, God, seest me.
Ruth closed her swollen, aching eyes, a deep feeling of comfort and awe washing over her as she whispered those words. Yes, God saw. God knew. There was unspeakable consolation in that. She harboured no bitterness, even toward Nutkin. She did not rail against the law that had sent her boy to prison, nor did she try to justify Ishmael's actions. He had done wrong, but it was in light-heartedness and thoughtlessness, not in malice. None of these thoughts weighed on her simple mind. All she needed to know was that God had seen it all. He knew everything. In that knowledge, Ruth found the strength and consolation she needed. She would endure, trusting in Him who is invisible. Chapter 5 turned adrift. The hay harvest and the corn harvest passed by, with long hours of labour in the sunshine, and Ruth remained one of the busiest women working on Chip Chase's farm. No one noticed much change in her, for she had always been a quiet, inoffensive woman, minding her own business and keeping to herself. But as the harvest ended and the shooting season began, the term of Ishmael's imprisonment was nearing its end. Nutkin and his assistant keepers were busy in the woods, patrolling them all night, while the crash of guns echoed through the day. It was not an ideal time for Ishmael to return home, with so much to stir up her husband's anger and remind him of his threats. But surely, Ruth thought, Humphrey wouldn't be so hard as to turn Ishmael out when the law let him go free.
Ishmael's time in prison is finished tomorrow,
She said one evening, her voice trembling with the deep anxiety she was trying to conceal.
Aye,
Humphrey answered slowly.
that's what Nutkin says. So I went up to the hall this morning early, and I says to the squire, Squire, I've been an honest man all my life, worked on your hedges many a year. I'm not going to harbour no poacher in my home. That lad of mine, who's been a disgrace to me, is coming out of county jail tomorrow. He'll never set foot over my doorsill, I promise you. The squire says, as you choose, Humphrey, go into the kitchen and get a draught of ale. And good ale it was, a sight better than that at the labour in vain. I'm not the man to drink the squire's good ale and go against him in any way.
You'll never turn the lad adrift on the world, would you?
Ruth cried, her voice breaking with desperation.
Adrift! He's big enough to shift for himself!
Humphrey replied doggedly.
The squire could have us turned out of here neck and crop if he chose, and what you'd become of me if we had to go to the workhouse. The squire won't tolerate a poacher living near his woods, and who's to keep me from the workhouse in my old age, eh? Me who can't do without my drop of good ale often and regular. I tasted the beer in the workhouse once, never again. No, Ishmael won't set foot over that doorsill again. Now thou knows it, and can make the best on it.
Ruth spent another sleepless night, the weight of her sorrow pressing on her like the first bitter grief, now come back tenfold. As dawn crept in, Ruth was already awake, long before the light. She busied herself gathering all of Ishmael's coarse clothing, the scanty bundle she had scraped together for him 3 months ago, when he was set to start earning his living. Mrs. Chipchase, who was taking her butter to market in the county town, had kindly offered to take Ruth along in the gig so she could meet Ishmael at the gate of the county jail. Ruth hardly noticed the dusty road or the bustling market streets as they rode. It was only when the jail came into view that she seemed to shake off her daze. The prison stood outside the town, surrounded by green fields, a large, square, grim building with thick black stone walls. Its small round windows, heavily barred, looked like hooded eyes staring blankly over the empty fields. As Ruth looked up at the forbidding structure, a shiver ran through her despite the warm September sun overhead. She wondered which of those dark windows had lighted Ishmael's cell. But before she reached the heavy gate, she saw him, her boy, Ishmael, walking slowly down the path, his steps sluggish, his head bowed low.
Mother!
He cried, his voice breaking with emotion.
Mother!
He threw himself into her arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Ruth couldn't weep, but she held him tight, clinging as though she could never let him go. Finally, he lifted his head to look into her face. There was no one around to witness their reunion, only the grim, ugly jail looming behind them like a silent, hollow-eyed witness. She led him to a quiet spot beneath the prison walls, and they sat on the grass. With trembling hands, she untied the small packet of home-baked bread she had brought, and they shared the simple meal together before they would have to part again.
I never meant any harm, Mother,
Ishmael said once they had finished.
I wasn't thinking of anything but Elsie wishing for the eggs. But I know now it was poaching. And oh, Mother, it's going to follow me all my life.
I'm afraid it might, lad.
Ruth answered with a sigh.
But hast thou asked God's forgiveness, Ishmael?
Often, Mother, often.
He replied eagerly.
I never forgot to sing Glory to Thee, my God, this night. I sang it low, in a whisper, like I used to when Father was home. I thought you'd be singing it too, Mother.
Aye,
she said softly.
Thank God I could sing it after the first night, Ishmael.
When I get home,
he continued,
I'll go up to the hall and ask the squire to forgive me. I'll beg and pray of him. Maybe if he forgives me, I can go to work with Mr. Chipchase like I was supposed to, before all of this.
Mr. Chipchase has already got another waggoner's boy,
Ruth said, her voice heavy with sorrow.
And thee can't come home with me, Ishmael. Father won't hear of it, and if the squire finds out, we might be turned out altogether. But if God has forgiven thee—
Not go home with you, Mother,
Ishmael cried, his voice breaking with disbelief.
No,
she answered, half sobbing.
No, lad, but God sees us, God knows. Jesus Christ himself had no place to lay his head and wandered without a home. Ishmael, I want thee to believe that God sees us always, and he loves us even when it seems like he doesn't notice. If I thought for a moment that God didn't see or didn't care, my heart would break. I'd go down to the river yonder and drown myself, but one day he'll find us a home again, you and me."
Ruth had never spoken so passionately before, not even to Ishmael, and her words startled him. He gazed at her agitated face with wide, wondering eyes, then glanced back at the dreary jail, the place that had been his most recent dwelling. It felt as though there was no place for him in the entire world, now that he had been behind those prison walls.
"Where can we find a home again, Mother?"
he asked at last, his voice heavy with despair.
"There's no place like home."
"Up there,"
she replied, lifting her dim eyes to the vast sky above.
"If God doesn't give us another home here in this world, he's got one ready for us there. Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you. That's what Jesus said, Ishmael. He's preparing a place for us, and we mustn't trouble our hearts too much. Only we must keep on believing in him."
"I'll try, Mother,"
Ishmael whispered, slipping his hand into hers. They sat quietly together for a long time, not saying much, their hands tightly clasped. The distant chiming of the church clocks from the town finally reminded Ruth that there was still work to be done. She had to find a place where Ishmael could sleep that night and, if possible, somewhere he could stay until he found work. It was hard for her to leave him. The thought of her boy wandering the streets, trying to pick up any odd job a boy with a tarnished reputation could find, tore at her heart. She knew how precarious such a life could be. Just months ago, Ishmael had still been a child, and in a better home, he would still be considered one. Punished for his mistakes, yes, but not cast into want and temptation. But Ishmael was now thrust into the thick of life's hardest battles, stripped of his good name and deprived of the company of decent people. Yet Ruth held on to hope and faith. She worked harder than ever, not taking a single day of rest, so that she could save a few pence each week to send to help him. She knew Ishmael was almost always hungry, often cold, and barely had shoes on his feet. He roamed the countryside, going from farmstead to farmstead, doing any odd job farmers were willing to trust him with, and sleeping in whatever outhouse or broken shed he could find. But he struggled to secure a steady position, as there were many boys with good reputations also seeking work. There was one thing Ishmael couldn't bring himself to do. He couldn't put so much distance between himself and his mother that he couldn't see her every Sunday. He never failed to slip homeward at the end of the week, hiding in the lime kiln or the woods, keeping out of sight from his father until he could signal his presence to his mother. Those moments together became the greatest solace in Ruth's life. She could still wash and mend his clothes and provide him with a good meal or two, listening intently to all that had happened to him during the week. Ishmael never crossed the threshold of his old home, but in the summer evenings they would sit together hidden among the green brushwood behind it. During the cold winter nights, they would shelter under the walls of the old kiln, or, when they needed a roof over their heads, they would meet in the limestone cave, often Ishmael's makeshift home. Chapter 6. 5 years. 5 years passed, and still Ishmael had not grown into a man. The hope of him becoming a strong, hardy, capable one was fading. The hardships and privations he had endured had taken their toll on his small, thin, and weak frame. But even more than his physical struggles, the anxieties and mortifications of his life had crushed his spirit. No one cared for him but his mother. Suspicion followed him everywhere, and the company he was forced to keep only reinforced that suspicion. Ishmael was losing heart, sinking into hopelessness. His mother had named him Ishmael because the Lord had heard her affliction. But perhaps it would have been more fitting to name him Ishmael for the other reason. Every man's hand was against him. Ruth feared the day when his hand would turn against every man in return. The last few years had weighed heavily upon Ruth, more so than 10 would have if Ishmael had been at home. She could no longer help her husband up the ladder when he came home drunk, and many a night he lay groaning on the cold, damp floor, racked with rheumatic pain, for want of a strong young arm like Ishmael's to support him. Yet, despite it all, every Sunday brought Ruth a small ray of joy. Ishmael, despite all the temptations surrounding him, had not strayed from the right path, and that comforted her in her own sorrows. But what would become of him when she was no longer there to help him? It was a painful trial for Ruth when she heard Ishmael's plaintive, low call circling the hut on cold winter nights. She longed to answer, but if her husband sat crouched over the fire, she dared not open the door. Ishmael's call would come closer, nearer still, until it seemed to echo under the very eaves of the house. She would catch a glimpse of his pale face through the darkened window, pressed against the lattice panes, watching for a sign of her. Then, as no answer came, his long, low cry would grow fainter and fainter until it died away into the woods behind the house.
I must tell Nutkin about that owl.
Old Humphrey grumbled peevishly. Ruth, once tireless in her work, could now hardly leave her bed in the cramped loft. She was almost helpless, struggling even to make her way down the ladder to the hearth below. Old Humphrey, with his mind dulled by years of drinking, couldn't grasp that she was no longer the willing drudge she had been for so long. The idea that death might soon release her from her burdens never crossed his sodden brain. He often moaned about her idleness at the labour in vain, where he now sat on the farthest corner of the bench, no longer welcomed as in his better days when he could afford to be generous. Yet, when Sunday came, it was as though new life flowed into Ruth. She couldn't explain where the strength came from, but it never failed her. She would rise from her bed, creep downstairs, and make her way out into the fresh spring sunshine to meet Ishmael. Everyone in the village knew by now, except for Humphrey, that Ishmael visited the old home to see his dying mother, but no one interfered. Instead, they quietly brought food, ostensibly for Ruth, though they knew she could hardly eat. Some of the women offered to help with her washing and said nothing when Ishmael's clothes were included. There is something about the nearing shadow of death that changes how people see us. Kindness and tenderness, which might have made life's journey easier all along, often come only as we descend visibly into the valley of the shadow of death. Ruth, who had lived so long in sorrow and solitude, was touched by the friendliness that now surrounded her in her last days.
It makes home seem sweeter,
She said to Ishmael one Sunday, her voice soft with gratitude.
to have plenty of friends and plenty of everything else, but if it had always been like this, I might never have thought of dying as going home. Now I always think of heaven as home, Ishmael.
A faint smile lighting up her wrinkled face. They were sitting together on the old doorstep for what would be the last time, though neither of them knew it. When death approaches, we rarely recognise the final moments of the familiar tasks and routines of daily life. It had been a long, sunny May day, but now twilight was falling, and with each passing minute, Ruth's beloved face seemed to grow thinner and more shadowy.
It feels almost,
She continued falteringly,
like when I was a little girl and I'd hear Father calling me in from my play. I'm partly afeard to say it, Ishmael, but sometimes it feels like I can hear the blessed Lord calling, "Ruth, come to me, and ye shall find rest."
Ishmael listened, his heart heavy as he watched her expression grow softer, her eyes filled with a light of peace and acceptance.
And last night,
She continued, her voice soft but resolute.
I answered him out loud, "Lord, I can't rest because of my lad Ishmael." And it seemed to me as if a low, quiet voice whispered back, "Leave Ishmael to me. He is my son." And I said to myself, the Lord has heard my affliction again.
Ishmael sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the pale yellow sky behind the tops of the trees, where a bat flitted back and forth. Yet he neither saw the fading light nor the bat's flight, lost as he was in his mother's words. She continued, almost joyously,
And today I knew he'd heard me, for Mrs. Clift and Miss Elsie came to see me. "Ishmael, my lad, they brought grand news for thee. They're going away across the seas to that country where folks go for a better chance than they've got here, and they've promised to take thee with them. Mrs. Clift said it was all along of Elsie that Ishmael got into trouble and disgrace, and folks won't think badly of him there. I'll be like a mother to him," she said. And then I knew for sure that God had heard my affliction again.
Oh, Mother,
Ishmael cried, overwhelmed.
I couldn't leave thee, never, not even if the Queen of England sent for me.
"But oh, my lad,
Ruth answered, her voice full of earnest pleading.
If the Lord doesn't take me home before the time comes for thee to go, thee must leave me. I should die happier knowing thee was safe, having a chance to be a good man rather than leaving thee here to be tempted and driven into sin. Ishmael, promise me thee'll go whether I'm alive or dead when the time comes. Oh, my dear, dear lad, promise to obey me.
I cannot, mother, I cannot.
Ishmael sobbed.
I'll go gladly if thee are gone, but as long as thee can speak to me, and I can look at thee, I cannot leave.
They're not going until after the hay harvesting,
she said softly.
And please God, I may be gone by then.
But as she lay awake that night, thinking of Ishmael, who slept soundly in his old shelter, the limestone cave, she wondered what would become of him if she couldn't persuade him to leave while she was still living. There would be no one who loved her to close her eyes, hold her hand, or whisper words of love in her final moments if Ishmael were gone. Yet, how gladly would she die alone if it meant knowing he was safe, with a fresh start in life. The days passed slowly. The grass grew, blossomed, and ripened for the scythe. But life clung to Ruth, though she longed for death to set Ishmael free. She could no longer climb down the ladder from the loft, where she lay in near darkness. But whenever Humphrey was away, Ishmael sat beside her, close enough to reach out and hold her hand, just as he had when he was a small child. There was no shortage of food for him now. Mrs. Clift came every day with Elsie, and Mrs. Chipchase regularly sent provisions from the farm, or stopped by to visit Ruth herself. Neither came empty-handed. Only when the time came each day for Ishmael to slip away from his father's wrath did he feel like an exile from his own home.
I'll not leave thee tonight,
Ishmael said one evening, his voice trembling as he watched his mother, who seemed worse than he'd ever seen her.
I can't leave thee tonight. Maybe thou art dying.
Nay,
she answered with a long, low, sad sigh.
Nay, Ishmael, there mustn't be a fight twixt thy father and thee over my dying bed.
He will come home drunk,
Ishmael said, his voice fierce with emotion.
And I can't leave thee alone with him.
I'm not afeard to be left alone with thy father,
Ruth replied gently.
He was a good husband to me once, and he'll not be hard with me when I'm dying. I wasn't always as good a wife as I might have been, and there's much I need to say to him. They're running to tell thee he's coming up the lane. Go, Ishmael, kiss me and go quickly.
I cannot go,
Ishmael cried, clinging to her.
Perhaps I shall never see thy face again, never. Oh, mother, I cannot go.
As he held her tightly, unwilling to let go, Ruth pushed him away with what little strength she had left. Just then, Elsie's clear young voice echoed from the kitchen below, calling urgently.
Ishmael?
She cried, breathless and hurried.
Little Willie Nutkin is lost in the old quarry behind the cave, and we need you. Nutkin, the squire, everyone, we all need you.
Chapter 7. Her Last Command. Ishmael released his hold on his mother, but remained kneeling beside her. A faint light from the room below illuminated Ruth's face as she looked into his with earnest, searching eyes.
I can't leave my mother,
he said in a loud but strained voice.
She's dying, and if I go, I may never see her again.
Ishmael,
Ruth said gently.
Thee has never forgiven Nutkin, has thee?
No,
he muttered.
No, it's been too much to forgive. He drove me away from home, and I could have been a man by now, instead of a wastrel, if he hadn't been so hard on me. And thee wouldn't have worked thyself to death, mother, if it hadn't been for him. No, I haven't forgiven him. Let him find his little lad on his own.
You must come, Ishmael,
called Elsie.
Willie's been missing for over 5 hours. We can hear him crying in the old quarry, and no one knows it like you do. The opening's too small for a man to crawl through, and no boy would go in alone, even if they would try. Oh, come quickly. Suppose he wandered into one of those pools you told me about and drowned. Come down this minute.
But Ishmael did not move, still holding his mother's hand tightly and gazing sorrowfully into her pleading face.
If I bid thee go,
she murmured.
Thee wouldn't disobey me now, would thee, knowing I'm dying?
Don't send me,
he pleaded.
Don't bid me go.
Nay,
she replied tenderly.
I'm bound to bid thee, and thee art bound to go. It would be no comfort to see thee by my side if I couldn't die in peace, thinking of the little lad trapped in the pit. And it's partly because thee hasn't forgiven Nutkin, and if we forgive not men their sins, neither will our Heavenly Father forgive ours. That's what our blessed Lord says. And oh, if thee forgives him, the Lord will forgive thee. Go, Ishmael, I shall see thee again, not here maybe, but in some better place.
I'll go.
He answered, looking sorrowfully into her face.
But, oh, if I never see thee again in this world, it'll be hard to wait till we meet in heaven.
Still, Elsie's impatient and imploring voice reached them, urging him to hurry. His mother's sunken eyes were fixed on him, filled with a look that seemed to plead for him to go. Knowing it might be the last time he'd ever see her, Ishmael sighed heavily, bent to kiss her, and fearing he'd lose his resolve if he stayed, quickly descended the ladder. Pushing through the brambles and brushwood, he hurried to the entrance of the cave. The place was no longer dark and empty. Villagers had gathered, and the glimmer of several lanterns cast a lurid, flickering light. At the far end of the cave, Nutkin knelt before the low, narrow entrance, straining to hear what sounded like his child's cries in the darkness.
Nutkin, the men will be here soon with pickaxes, and we'll have the little fellow out in no time, my man.
I'm more afeard of the picks bringing the old roof in than aught else, sir. There's been a lot of heavy rain lately, and 2 or 3 hollows have already caved in above ground. If the roof gives way between us and the little lad, he'd die of fright before we could dig him out. If only the hole was big enough for a man to crawl through. But no one could get through a hole no bigger than a rabbit burrow. Only a tiny creature like little Willie.
A profound silence followed, as not a man or woman present could bear the thought of risking the life of any of their boys by sending them into the old quarry. Amid the silence, a low, stifled voice spoke up.
I can crawl through. I know every step of the old pit.
Ishmael Medway! Half a dozen voices cried out joyously. He's the lad for this, if anyone is. He felt himself being pushed forward to the far end of the cave, where the light was strongest. The thin, stunted lad in his tattered clothes, with a face worn and sorrowful, now stood in front of the squire and his old enemy, who looked at him half in shame, half in hope.
Mother sent me,
Ishmael said, touching his ragged cap to the squire.
She's dying, and I don't think I'll ever see her again. But she couldn't face her end peacefully with the little lad still lost in the pit. She told me that if someone claims to be a Christian but refuses to forgive, then Christ won't forgive them. They haven't truly understood his forgiveness if they're clinging to bitterness. I want to follow Christ sincerely, even though it's hard. I want to walk in his footsteps. As for the pickaxes, I slept here last night and heard the ground give way. Don't set any picks to work.
Without waiting for an answer, Ishmael lay down on the ground and crawled into the narrow, winding tunnel he had known since boyhood. He called back to them when he reached the shaft where he could stand, and they saw the flicker of his light, but after a moment all sound and sign of him was lost. Nutkin and the squire, who had been watching and listening, rose from their knees, and the glimmer of the lanterns revealed tears in their eyes.
I'll make a man of that lad,
the squire said in a choked voice.
God Almighty bring him and Willie back safe,
cried Nutkin, sinking down on his knees again.
I'll treat him as my own son for as long as I live. So help me, God.
The villagers crowded the cave in tense silence, listening so intently they could hear the heavy drops of water splashing into pools below from the rain-soaked ground. Once, a low rumbling, like distant thunder, signalling a shift in one of the many galleries, made them hold their breath and look anxiously at each other. Then, as if Ishmael sensed their dread and wanted to reassure them, his voice rang out, calling back from the hidden pathways.
God bless him,
exclaimed the squire, a brief smile crossing his anxious, clouded face.
Aye,
Chipchase chimed in.
He was as good a lad as ever breathed, even before he went to jail for them pheasants' eggs. And old Ruth, his mother, you could trust her in a room full of golden guineas. She's as good a soul as ever lived. Ishmael said she was dying, didn't he, sir?
Yes,
answered the squire.
And she'd send him away from her to save Nutkin's little lad, said
Chipchase.
That's what I call being a Christian. Any minute, The roof could come down on him and bury him alive, and old Ruth knows it. But if anyone in Broadmoor truly believes in God, it's Ruth."
The farmer's voice trembled as he finished, and he turned his face away from the light, ashamed for his neighbours to see the depth of his emotion.
Old Ruth's had a hard, bitter
Said
life.
Mrs. Chipchase, her voice thick with emotion.
She was near broken-hearted when Ishmael went to jail. She's never been the same woman since. Ishmael was the apple of her eye, he was, and he's had worse luck than all her other children, thanks to Nutkin. I've always said so, and I'll say it till my dying day. What was a boy's taking a few poultry eggs, I ask you?
I'll treat him like my own son,
Muttered Nutkin, not raising his head.
We must make it up to him,
Added the squire.
If I'd known he was a good lad, he'd never have gone to jail.
Hush!
Cried Elsie, who stood beside Mrs. Chipchase. Immediately, a breathless stillness filled the cave, and every eye turned toward the low outer entrance, where the sound of weary footsteps could be heard approaching, bent nearly double and tottering as if every step might be her last. Old Ruth herself entered, looking round at her neighbours with eyes dim and glazed.
Where's Ishmael?
She asked, her gaze moving over the familiar faces. Chapter 8, Going Home. When Ishmael had obeyed her command and left her deathbed, Ruth lay still for a little while in utter solitude. After the echo of Ishmael's and Elsie's footsteps faded, not a sound reached her ears. She was used to being alone, but this solitude felt unbearably heavy in her final hours. An overwhelming yearning arose in her to see her boy once more, to know what he was facing and what might befall him. He had gone into danger at her bidding, and until she knew what became of him, she felt unable even to turn her thoughts fully to the God in whom she trusted. If only Humphrey would come home, she thought. She might persuade him to go after Ishmael to the cave and bring her word of what was happening. How could she die in peace while her boy was in such immediate danger? She lifted herself, straining to hear even a distant sound of voices or footsteps, but there was only silence and solitude. Then, with a feverish strength born of the dying, she felt a sudden urgency to be nearer to Ishmael, to have faces around her, and to hear her neighbours' voices. With feeble, hurried hands, she dressed herself in the worn old clothes she had laid aside for the last time. With faltering steps, she descended the steep ladder. Cool evening air softly brushing her face revived her, and for a moment she felt it was only lying in the stifling loft that had made her think herself so near death. But as she struggled through the tangled brushwood, barely able to part the hazel twigs barring her path, the numbing weight of death pressed upon her more and more heavily. She heard the voices of neighbours passing in the woods, but she could not call loudly enough for them to hear her. The thrushes sang high in the tree branches, still catching the last light of sunset, but below her path lay in darkness, and her sight was fading. Half blind, stumbling over tree roots, faint from exhaustion, yet driven by her deep love for her son, Ruth finally reached the cave. She had come to die somewhere near where Ishmael was.
"Didn't he say his mother was dying?"
Murmured some in the crowd, stepping aside to make way for her. But as soon as they saw her face by the light of the lanterns, they knew she was indeed dying. She tottered forward, her steps faltering, to the far end of the cave, where she sank to the ground, breathing fitfully, her sunken eyes gleaming with a bright, unearthly light. Nutkin shrank back, awestruck by her presence, but Ruth smiled faintly and motioned with her hand for him to keep his place, watching and listening as he had since Ishmael had entered the old quarry. Yet he stood there, pale and shaken, looking down at her as if she were a vision risen from the dead.
Ruth!
Called Mrs. Clift, the schoolmistress, stepping forward from among the villagers.
How did you get here?
She sat down beside her on the ground and gently drew Ruth's grey head onto her lap. Ruth looked up with gratitude, gathering her waning strength to reply.
I was afeard,
she whispered,
that I'd never see Ishmael again, and God helped me. The poor lad would grieve if he never saw me again, and it'll be easier to die here than alone at home.
Some of us ought to have thought of you.
the schoolmistress murmured gently.
It's best here.
Ruth whispered, near to Ishmael.
God's been very good to me all my life, and he's very good to me now I'm dying. I'd rather wait here for him to come back than be anywhere else. Only I'll miss seeing Humphrey. He was a good husband to me once.
Ruth Medway,
the squire said slowly and clearly so she could hear him.
Don't you worry about your son. I'll look after him and make a man of him. I give you my solemn promise.
Ruth looked up, straining to see his face, unfamiliar and blurred to her fading eyes.
Who is it?
She asked.
The squire,
the schoolmistress said softly.
I thank you humbly, sir,
she replied, making an effort.
But I'm afeard it's too late now. He's going away to a new country as soon as I'm gone. A place where he'll have a better chance. He won't leave me, sir, not while I live, even if he starves for it. But he'll go as soon as I'm dead.
I'll make it worth his while to stay,
said the squire firmly.
There won't be no home when I'm gone,
Ruth murmured.
He's not had a home these 5 years, and like him who had no place to lay his head.
She closed her eyes and lay still, breathing in heavy, uneven gasps, while all around her, the villagers stood in sombre silence, watching over her.
He's long in coming,
she murmured at last.
And it's growing dark, very dark. It's time to sing Glory to Thee. It'll cheer him, maybe, wherever he is. Only I can't begin.
She wishes us to sing Glory to Thee,
said Mrs. Clift, looking around at the grave, sorrowful faces surrounding them.
She says it will cheer Ishmael, and it will, if he can just catch a distant sound of it. Some of you belong to the choir. Please start it, for I cannot.
Her voice broke, low and wavering, and for the first few lines, the hymn trembled on the villagers' lips. But Ruth's eyes brightened, and a smile spread across her grey, weathered face as the familiar melody and words reached her dimming ear. Her lips moved, and now and then a faint whisper of a word or two could be heard by the schoolmistress. When they reached, "Praise God, from whom all blessings flow," every voice joined in a loud, clear, heartfelt chorus. In the silence that followed, a sound echoed softly, as though the words were being carried back through the winding galleries of the quarry. Ruth lifted her head, and with a sudden strength, rose to her feet and leaned against the opening to listen.
I can hear him,
she said joyfully.
And I shall see him again. I bid him go, for I was afeard he hadn't forgiven Nutkin, but my heart went with him. He's the only one of 'em all that cares for their old mother. It's the way of young folks,
she added, as if excusing them herself.
But Ishmael was loath to leave me for fear I'd die afore he got back. But I'm here, Ishmael, my lad. I'm close beside thee. Thee and me'll see each other again.
She sank slowly back to the ground, and the neighbours gathered around her once more. She was only a poor, old, hard-working woman, long known to them all and little thought of. Yet there was not one of them who did not grieve for her, or silently wish they'd done more to ease her hard life. Nutkin knelt beside her, his sunburnt face vibrant with life, in stark contrast to her thin, pallid features.
Ruth, forgive me,
he pleaded.
I would rather have lost my right hand if I'd known it before. It was my wicked hatred that did it. I would have turned a blind eye to any other lad robbing a pheasant's nest. But I hated the very name of Medway.
I never thought there was anything to forgive,
Ruth answered.
It's the law, I know, and the justices are wise men, but Ishmael couldn't forgive it until now.
Before anyone could respond, a shout came through the narrow opening, followed by a child's voice calling,
Father!
Ruth lifted her head, her face lighting up with a smile.
He's coming,
she said softly.
God is very good to us.
A few slow minutes passed before they heard Ishmael's footsteps and his gentle voice speaking to the child, who chattered back as if he felt no fear of him or of the strange place they were in. Soon the child's tear-stained face emerged through the archway, yet no one stirred or spoke except Nutkin, who quickly took his boy into his arms, hushing him into silence. Then Ishmael came back, and his old mother leaned forward, her eager, dying face alight with joy. Waiting to see him once more, he crept out slowly and reluctantly, uneasy in front of so many familiar faces, and eager to slip away out of sight. His dazzled eyes made out only a crowd of faces around him, and he did not see his mother until her weak voice broke the silence, startling him.
Ishmael!
She called.
Mother!
He cried, his voice sharp with surprise and joy. He flung himself down beside her, wrapping his arm around her and gently drawing her head to his chest.
I couldn't stay away.
She murmured.
God help me to come. Be good, Ishmael. God sees us all always. I'll watch for thee on the doorsill to come into the Father's house, boldly, where he's gone to prepare a place, and then we'll be at home again, with him.
Her words fell slowly, one by one, from her lips, which were growing still with death. The bright light in her sunken eyes flickered and went out, but a faint, peaceful smile remained on her wrinkled face. And as Ishmael called her name, in a voice filled with grief and loneliness, she tried to lift her head, straining to look once more into her son's face.
Ishmael,
she whispered,
because the Lord has heard thy affliction.
And with that last breath, she passed from this world, her hand still resting in her son's, as the villagers around them stood silent, bearing witness to her final peace. Chapter 9, A New Home. It was a solemn and nearly silent procession that moved through the midnight woods, stirring the sleeping birds in their nests and startling timid rabbits in their burrows. The moon shone down from a clear sky, casting a white light over the open spaces and deepening the shadows beneath the thick hazel bushes. Elsie walked beside Ishmael, her hand in his, acutely recalling that day 5 years ago, the day that had sown the seeds of his sorrow. But beyond the present grief, there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon, though he could not yet see it clearly. In only a few days, Elsie and her mother were set to sail for America, and once Ishmael had seen his mother's frail, worn-out body laid in the old churchyard, he would be free to go with them, beginning a new life in a new land. When they reached the hut, they found old Humphrey lying in a drunken stupor on the damp floor below the ladder, unable to climb up to the loft. They had to drag him aside to carry their burden to its resting place above. The years of drink had softened and dulled his mind, and he could not be made to understand what had happened, nor could he be persuaded to let Ishmael stay even for a few hours in his old home. Only now and then, when his father was away during the days leading up to the funeral, could Ishmael slip in to gaze at his mother's calm and peaceful face. The wrinkles, sharply carved by years of trouble, seemed almost smoothed away in death. Every home in the parish, however, opened its doors to him, the castaway, who had been driven from his own house and left to the world. He followed his mother to the grave, standing for the last time with his father and brothers. A crowd of villagers and neighbours had gathered around, and Nutkin was there too, holding the little boy, whom Ishmael had saved from the quarry's winding passages.
I'd like to shake hands with all the Medways,
said Nutkin as the crowd began to disperse.
And let bygones be bygones. And Ishmael, the squire, bid me ask if there's anything he can do for you. Anything that'd make it worth your while to stay home instead of going to America.
Nothing,
answered Ishmael.
There's no home for me now that Mother's gone. It was home, sweet home, and I'll never have another.
But 10 years later, when Ishmael returned to England, not to stay, but only to visit the old place, he had built a home of his own, with Elsie as his wife. He owned a farm and was prospering in every way. He found the old hut fallen into ruin, his father having died in the workhouse the year after Ishmael left England. Since then, no one had lived in the desolate hovel. The old doorsill was still there, though the thatched roof had long since decayed. He could almost imagine his mother sitting there, watching out for him as she used to. The trees behind the ruins tossed their green branches in the wind, and the blue sky, dotted with clouds, shone above, just as it had in the days gone by. The familiar sounds were still there, the song of birds, the hum of insects, the rustling of countless leaves. But still, it was no longer home. His mother, who had made even that poor hut a home, was gone.
I remember,
said Elsie softly, her hand in his.
I remember your mother said, I shall watch for thee on the doorsill, to come into the Father's house boldly, where the Lord Jesus has gone to prepare a place, and you and me will be at home again with Christ, forever with the Lord.
Children, do you see what we mean by the phrase, "There is no place like home"? It is not a reference to your earthly home, though your earthly home may be sweet, perhaps even one with a father who loves the Lord, unlike Ishmael's father. But eternity. Eternity is what lies before us all. How often we focus on earthly dwellings and yet neglect to consider eternity. Have you come to Christ, trusting in Him alone for salvation? He is the Christ who transforms hearts, making those who are unwilling to forgive become willing, as they realize the depth of His forgiveness toward them. Oh, there truly is no place like home, home with the Lord. Will you be there for eternity? Turn to Christ, all the ends of the earth, and you will be saved. You too can come into the Father's house boldly, if you come by faith in Christ, clothed in His righteousness. This audiobook was produced by scrollreader.com. Visit our website to hear more free Christian audiobooks or obtain paperback copies.